There you are.
Welcome to the only Burlington area television trivia program here on Channel 17 this 19th day of December 2019. Stump the Chumps. We talk of back in the day when milk was 19 cents a quart and pot was a ceramic container. And you paid the newspaper boy on Saturday when he knocked on the door to collect the money for the free press of the Daily News. I'm your host, Bill Keough, born and brought up in Burlington and was an elected official at one time. And my co-host is Joey Donovan, who had a similar background. Welcome, Joey.
Thanks,
good to see
Bill.
you here
Good to be
again.
here, yes.
And our special guest today is Jane Merola McKenzie. Jane, you were born at, wait a minute, I said, Jane.
I need a hat?
You need a hat. You need a hat. Does that work for you? All
great.
right.
Looks great.
This is Christmas season.
You're kind of, screwing up my do here, Bill.
Okay.
But, no, I'm kidding.
This is our annual Christmas show.
Yeah, right.
Thank you so much for having me. I remember watching the show way back when Herb and Al Bernardini did it. And
They started the whole thing. You had the Boardmans and the Crowleys and
absolutely.
the Donovans and the Lettys and the whole
you
gang.
guys do a great job with it.
So you grew up in Burlington?
I grew up in Burlington in a neighborhood that really is no more. It was where eventually became urban renewal. Now they refer to it as Little Italy. We never really knew it as that. We just knew it as home.
By the way, you don't have to wear that hat on if you don't.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
I like the spirit.
Where was that, on Bank Street?
Well, it encompassed 17 acres down in the Cherry Street, parts of Cherry, St. Paul, South Champlain, Battery, and my grandfather's grocery store was now what is the Hotel Vermont and
Oh, wow.
Hen of the Woods. And so that was kind of our home base.
So did that back right into the Nana house on Battery Street and big gardens and farms?
No, the Nanas were across the street and down from us.
Oh, they were.
We were a couple doors down from the Albarellis and the Verchionis.
Isn't it
and
amazing to
Oh yeah, all
listen
the
to all
names.
those names?
Yep.
We lived actually on Champlain Street, right across from the Aveltis. Wasn't all Italians. There were some, Irish people, some French people, and we never really thought of it ethnically. It was just they were your neighbors.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, was that a traumatic, when you were required to move from there, some of the people in today say that was really a bad thing for Burlington. But as I recall, there were some very downtrodden areas. That the Sisters of Mercy used to go down to Battery Street on weekends and help the impoverished people.
Yep.
What was your experience with that?
Well, I was there till I was, we moved a couple of blocks up onto Monroe Street when I was about 11, but my grandfather was still there. They lived up over the store at 35 Cherry Street. And for him, I think it was really traumatic. I mean, he could never really reconcile the fact that the government was coming in and taking his house that he had built and all the properties that he had acquired. He said to me, it's the same government that I sent my 4 boys off to the war, and I only got 3 back. He was older, and he was just having a hard time with it.
So was he a neighbor of Mrs. Dutra's?
Oh yeah, and she was.
She held out forever.
She did, and a lot of credit to her.
Yeah, we used to call it, you'd be at Henry's Diner and you'd be looking at this raised property there was nothing left.
She wasn't giving up easily.
And you could see her light. We used to call it, the lights are on at the Ponderosa.
It was always referred to as the Ponderosa.
She
I don't
was
know who
terrific.
started that. She was a great lady.
Yeah, she really
She
was.
was a great lady who just stood up for her family and said, until you find something comparable for me.
Yes.
The sad part of a little bit of that, not to make this a big downer, but a lot of older people that had their houses paid off for what they gave them.
Yeah.
I know Mrs. Nana was one of them, had to go out and take a mortgage at age 65 or 70 and couldn't have done it without a couple of her sons.
Art Hogan, there's a wonderful CD that Fletcher Library has that is sort of narrated by Art, who was head of that whole
Had urban renewal, yeah.
urban renewal. But it's tells the story through the voices of some of the people that were, had their properties taken and removed. And it's very informative. And for me, I recognize some high school classmates of mine that I didn't even know had that experience.
Sure.
I was very close to Terry Verchionis, but her house was saved. Across the street was taken.
But her grandparents' house
House was
wasn't.
taken. Yeah, that's right. That was around the corner.
And for all of us Italian families, it seemed like our grandparents was kind of home base for us. So
Yes.
as John Vericchione will attest, and I will, I never spent a Sunday at home. We
you
were
were at
always
dinner.
at dinner at my grandparents with all my
Okay.
cousins and uncles and
Wow.
brothers and sisters, and yeah.
Now, did you play sports?
I played a little bit of basketball in high school. I did.
Really?
Yeah, I wasn't as good as Joey though.
Well, did you play basketball with Joey?
I didn't.
No,
but-
Come
no,
on.
no. Jane's quite a bit younger.
But she was, you know, everybody talked about Joey. And
Oh,
how
yes,
great
they
she
did.
was.
Really? I know she's a great politician. I don't know
I
about her basketball.
always say that the only relative that ever saw me play basketball was my uncle, and he got paid to ref the game.
Uncle Don Maley.
Uncle Don Maley.
And he and my dad actually refereed a lot together. In those days, they would do this Northwestern League of girls basketball. And my father always tried to get me interested in basketball. I was more interested in going with him because he would give me his wallet and his keys to the car. So we'd be up in some small little town in, you know, either down in Virgins or up in, you know, Swanton, Vermont. He'd start to get into the game. I'd bring a girlfriend with me.
And you go to.
We'd take the car and just drive around town.
So your dad's name was what?
He was Robert Merola,
Now, who was Frank Merola?
my brother Frank.
Your brother Frank.
Yes.
Now, was your brother Frank was, I think I remember Frank as Rubber Legs. Was he
No,
called?
I think
That was
they,
an uncle.
No, they
Oh, your
called
uncle.
they called my father Rubber Legs.
Oh, your father. Okay. And why did they call your father Rubber Legs?
Well, apparently he wasn't very tall. He was only about 5'10", but he was a center, played center, and I guess he could jump incredibly well. And yeah, he got voted onto the all New England teams. And
Wow.
I remember him telling me that his biggest thrill of all of his basketball was they went down to Springfield, Massachusetts for the New England tournament, and Dr. Naismith, who created basketball,
Created
threw
basketball.
up the ceremonial first,
Oh my gosh.
the jump ball.
Wow.
What year was that? Do you know what year your
That
father
year,
played?
he graduated in 1940, so he played 38. I think he actually stayed out of school one year during the Depression. He went to work, but 37, 38, 39.
And who were some of his teammates? Do you remember that?
Sure, Hank Stannard.
Oh my gosh.
Geez,
And
yeah,
he was a
Hank.
great
He
athlete
was
too.
a great athlete. Caddy Lynch.
Oh my God.
Teddy Lynch had polio. Didn't he have polio?
This was Caddy Lynch.
Caddy Lynch.
Oh, Caddy
Caddy
Lynch.
Lynch,
Okay.
yeah. I'm trying to think of some of the other names.
Did Kenny Akey play around
Kenny
that
Akey
time?
played.
Yeah.
Bobo
Kenny-
Bursky at all? Was that name?
No, I don't remember that name.
Okay, okay. By the way, callers, if you've got a question for Jane Merola McKenzie or Joey Donovan, give us a call, 862-3966. Maybe you got a question about an old-time basketball player at Rice or Cathedral or Burlington High School. Give us a call, 862-3966. So how did you end your basketball career? Was that short-lived?
Yeah, I played a little bit in college.
Oh.
And then when I transferred to Trinity College, I played for the Trinity College team, and it wasn't, it wasn't well endowed. The program wasn't well endowed.
Hey, we got a caller, folks. Let's see who's on the line here. You're on the air. What's up, guy?
Hi, Bill. I want a question for Janie.
Go ahead.
I want to know in the basketball family of the Merolas, who had the best hook shot?
I think this is a
I think
plant.
it's a setup. Is this my buddy Pat McCann?
Yes, it is, my friend Janie. Janie had the best hook shot I've ever seen in basketball.
Pat and I were undefeated in our backyard.
Oh, that's
2-on-2. We
fabulous.
were a 2-on-2 team, and we always beat my brothers. So that
Now,
was
was
a
Pat a good basketball player?
That was unbelievable.
All right, Pat, were you a great basketball player?
I held my own, but no, not as good as some of the Merola boys like Jimmy, Frankie, and Mr. Merola. And Rubber Legs Merola was Robert Merola. He was a phenomenal basketball player.
Oh, that's great.
Hey, that's great. Good to hear from you, guy. I haven't seen you for a while.
Well, you get out of the Alderman, you're not in the big city of Burlington Alderman anymore, so I can't pound on you.
Okay, all right.
Thanks, Pat.
Thanks for
Thanks,
calling.
everybody. Have a great evening and Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Same to you. He's a great guy. He loves the city. He and I used to talk politics all the time.
He's my third brother.
He's a good third brother.
And grew up in that same neighborhood?
Yeah.
So now there's Sister Raymond. There was my aunt was a Sister Mercy, Sister Bernadine, and
Oh, no kidding.
yes, and you had Sister Raymond was.
Sister Raymond was my aunt, my
Your
father's
aunt.
sister, and taught Spanish. I had the unfortunate, maybe not the delight of being in her class.
How did that work?
Well, you know, my mother would get a call about every day or two about something that I did wrong.
No.
Yeah.
She
Well,
didn't call when things were going well, huh?
never called when things were going well. So every day I'd come home and my mother would say, Sister Raymond called again. I'm like, oh my God, she's killing me. No, she was great. She was
She was
really,
very well loved at Rice.
she was. She was a really bright lady. She spoke about 7 or 8 languages, and every summer she was off to Colombia,
Right,
learning
yep.
another language, or you know, she was.
How old do you think she was when she entered the convent?
She was 18 years old. She got out of school, and I remember the family oral history was that my grandfather was very disappointed. It was
Oh,
his
I can imagine how
first and
heartbreaking.
only daughter at that
Yes.
point, and when they entered the convent in those days, you couldn't see your family for a year.
Oh, is that right?
So
Whoa.
while you're a novitiate or a
Postulate.
Postulate, yeah,
And,
those different hoods or whatever you want to call them.
and then in the next year, they could come 2 by 2.
Right.
So her best friend, who was a Vercioni girl, Sister Pascal, do you remember
Oh,
her?
I do remember Sister
So they
Pascal.
were best of friends, so they would, kind of travel.
Sister
2 by
Pascal
2.
was very small, as I remember.
Sweet lady. Sweet lady.
And I think one of the memories I always have that perhaps you remember, and I'm sure Bill does remember, is the Sisters of Mercy 2 by 2 walking up Pearl Street from Cathedral back to the convent. And of course, they were not allowed to go alone, so they
Absolutely
always were a
not.
couple. And it's always been just such a vivid memory.
Yes.
Because they could have taken a school bus, but those who I think wanted just a little freedom
Yes, right.
would get a partner and they'd walk up the hill back to Mansfield Avenue.
Yeah, and those were the days when, I mean, as you remember, there were so many nuns.
Yes.
My aunt's sister Raymond died in 1992, and when she died, they told us this is the first time since this convent really got going in the 1800s that we have less than 100
Yes.
nuns
Wow.
there. And now, and in those last 20 years, it just nothing.
Have you been to Mount St. Mary's lately?
I have not.
No, that's up for sale.
I know it is, yeah.
I walked down to the through the pine grove, and the sisters have conserved that pine grove, so that is going to be there forever. And their cemetery is down
Yes.
there,
I was down there last year.
and it's such a beautiful,
It is.
peaceful place.
Yes.
And you see some of the sisters in the early years; they died rather at a young age.
yeah.
But as they got older, those sisters shared good health and longevity.
Yes, they did.
Many of them lived, including Sister Pascal and us. They lived very, very
Sister
good lives.
Pascal, wow. Okay.
She was just a nice lady.
I think Sister Raymond was in an uncle's class of mine from Cathedral High School.
Probably. She graduated in about 1929.
Yeah, it might even been no, it wasn't. My mother, I think, was 28, but at the same time.
So, Jane, when were you in the chapel at Mount St. Mary's last? Do you remember that at all?
The chapel, I think I went to Sister Cabrini's funeral mass
Okay.
up there. So maybe 5 years ago or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen at Mount St. Mary's. Probably none of us do, but that certainly
I'm
is a
worried about that
historic
chapel.
site.
Because it's not on a registry at all.
It's beautiful.
The chapel is just extraordinary, and I'm very concerned and I don't know why the sisters, I thought, did such very good planning, but somehow they didn't do what was necessary to have that on a historic registry, which would have protected it.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
So, what's your hobby is photography?
I do some photography on the side. Yeah.
Like what?
I like landscape
Oh, you
mostly.
do beautiful photography.
Landscapes, yeah.
So, how did you learn photography?
You know, when I was about 5 years old, my mother's brother, my Uncle Bill Kelly, got me a camera for Christmas.
What kind of camera was it?
It was a Brownie Hawkeye. Yeah, right? And I just, had that interest forever. When my Uncle Art was in the service, he brought home some German cameras, because it was in Germany, and some
Good cameras, I'll
some
bet.
Japanese cameras. The first good camera that I ever had was a Maya Secor. It was a 35 millimeter film camera. And I was just delighted about it.
So, did you do your own developing?
I did.
Did your
Yeah.
own darkroom?
I did my own darkroom, yeah. And then later, when I first got out of college, I worked for the Diocese of Burlington. I did cover stories for them and human interest stories, and I also did some photography. And they had a dark room, which was great, so
Sure.
I could do my own
Did
photography.
one in your house? Did you ever have?
I did.
You did?
Yep.
What, in the basement or?
Yep, in the basement.
Do
Wow.
you still develop your own?
I don't. I'm one of the last holdouts to go to digital, but it's so much easier and so less
It's so easy,
expensive,
yes.
easy, and it's so easily corrected.
Yeah, do you ever use a 4x5 camera at all?
I have a couple. I can't say that I've used them.
A speed graphic?
Not a speed graphic. I have, I'm trying to think of the name of it. I have one of my uncle's old Leica cameras.
Wow. Those are supposed to be the top-notch
They
camera
are.
with a great lens.
Yep, the Leicas were a German-made camera. The other cool camera that I remember, my uncle Louis, who also was a camera buff, had this little Minax camera. Do you remember those? They
Yeah.
were like spy
Yeah.
cameras during the war. It was about this big, and he gave that to me, and I still have it. Yeah.
Now, tell us about the Merola's All-Stars. The Merola family was great in sports. I don't know, well, you said you played basketball, but there was Art Merola, Louis Merola, John Merola,
AKA Rubber Legs.
Rubber, right, yeah.
Yeah, that was my
Tell me
father,
about
Robert.
the Merola's All-Stars.
Well, Merola, it was really my Uncle Louis that was very instrumental in starting a lot of the softball leagues.
The Continental League was,
He started the Continental League,
Yep.
and then he started, as they got older, the Twilight League for people that were over the age of 35, I think. And they kind of called themselves the Amazing Merola All-Stars because they never won a game. They were pathetic. But you never saw a bunch of guys have so much fun losing, and everybody wanted to play with them because it was just, they just had a lot of fun.
I think they used to bring a Catholic priest from the cathedral to play, and
Yeah, that's right.
whoever would show up
Could play.
at Roosevelt Park or
Yep.
wherever they could play. Just bring a glove, and you were.
Come on over.
And Louis was the coach, and
Yep.
everybody played, and someone
Yep.
sat out, and
Father Tinney was a priest at the cathedral, and we called him the angel in the outfield. He played right field, and Joe Scabelli, the football
Oh,
player.
yes.
Joe Sabelli, sure.
So he was, whenever he would come up to visit, he came over and played.
He was married to a McSweeney.
He was married to McSweeney.
Yeah, yeah.
And
He played for the Giants, if I remember correctly. New York
it's,
football.
Los Angeles Rams. I
Okay,
think.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And yeah, he was quite a guy, and it was people that couldn't get on another team. Uncle Louis would let them in, and they had a great time.
Louis brought him in,
Yeah.
and then everybody played.
Yeah.
Were you playing it, or were you umping?
played,
Or
yeah.
were you umping?
No, I
amazing
I could play
athletes.
in those days. I was the same caliber of my teammates. We just played, and that was fun. And if somebody made an error, that's the way it goes.
Yeah.
I got a message from Mike Vinton, who was a former Burlington police officer
Really? Mike Vinton?
and a state representative. And the only reason he contacted me was because of the softball and the Merolas. Because I think when he was a Burlington police officer, they had a team.
Yes.
And so he always remembers playing against this team and how much fun it was. And how
Is that
wonderful it was.
right?
Yes.
And they'd have great little parties after,
Yes, yeah,
where and nobody took it very
Would
seriously.
they play always at Roosevelt, or would it be
No,
South Park?
South Park, Roosevelt Park,
And Smalley Park.
Smalley Park,
Oh, Smalley.
Lakeside Park.
Yep. Oh, Lakeside Park.
Yep.
I remember Lakeside Park. There was too small. Actually, those Lakeside Park had a problem. I was superintendent of parks around that time,
Oh, okay.
and people would hit a home run in left field.
Through somebody's window.
In somebody's window. And man, did I get a call about that. These guys, they shouldn't be playing ball and all this.
Because
it's
it was
dark
a
at
small,
night.
it was a small
small
park,
park.
all with residential housing
Oh,
around it.
yeah. So anyway, the same thing happened with Smalley Park in baseball. I
Yeah.
mean, Joe Johnson used to hit him over against, Joe Angie hit him up against the wall in that White House in left field. Now they don't do that anymore. But
What years were you commissioner of the parks?
I think about 1960 to 1966, something like that.
And who appointed you?
Who appointed me? A guy by the name of Frank Kane appointed me. Here, we got a caller coming in here. Caller, you're on the air.
Hi, Bill, Joe, and Janie. This is Dee Dee Kell. I'd like to just ask a couple of questions about Burlington, of all of you. The first one is the bowling alley on Pearl Street.
Oh,
I
yeah.
wonder if any of your families recreated there. My husband and I were just talking about some fun that he enjoyed down there when he was maybe 14, 15 years old. I've sort of forgotten about it,
Yeah, that was
but I bet you all remember.
that was a great bowling alley. They were duck pins, as I remember,
Yes.
and under the NP.
Yep.
And that's where I learned to bowl. I remember my dad taking me there when I was a little
Is
kid.
that right next to Peeney's Pool Hall?
That was going to be my
I think
next
so.
question,
I
Joey.
think it was.
Dee Dee, what was the name of that pool hall right next to it?
Well, that's a good question. I only know the one in Winooski, Bill.
Oh, how about Peeney's on the Parkway?
Well, I'm sure. I'm sure you're right.
Okay.
You're right most of the time.
No. What's your second question, Dee Dee?
Well, I wanted to have Janie walk me through what a noon hour looked like when she was attending Cathedral Grammar School. Did she walk home from
Yeah,
from
we were.
lunch?
Joey and I were talking about that before we went on the air. When at Cathedral, you didn't have a lunch there, so everybody had to go home, and Mom
Yeah.
made lunch, and it was kind of a sort of our dinner in a way.
know.
You know,
Yeah.
it was so, and you know, for. I always felt bad for the kids that lived like, you know, like the Letty kids that lived way up the hill, because that was a little
Right.
bit of a hike, and you only got, as I remember, a half hour.
I think it was an
it
hour.
Friday?
I think I remember we used to get out about a little after 11:30. It had to be almost an hour and a half. Had to be back at 1.
Oh,
But we
okay.
went to school till
yeah.
3:30.
We did go late. Somehow
And
I thought
so-
it was small.
So I think the hours were probably the same.
Yeah.
But, and
No layovers at Hargraves or any of that such thing.
Well, I lived too close to school for a layover, and I would have got caught doing that. I think
You would have gotten caught.
I would have probably got caught doing that. And
were you
Campbell
able? Were you?
soup and grilled cheese sandwiches.
Yes.
Yep.
Thanks, you all. I really
Thanks,
enjoyed the
Dee Dee.
show.
Thanks for calling,
Thanks,
Dee
Dee
Dee.
Dee.
Now,
Yep.
were you able to shop at Iso's, or was that against all the
Oh
rules?
no, we could always go to ISO's.
Because
It seemed like every little community
Merola's
had
was on Cherry Street at that time.
a Cherry
right?
and Champlain. Yep. In an intersection that really is no longer.
Right.
My routine was I left Cathedral and I used to pick up the Boston Post newspaper at Colette's, and I would meet my father, and he would bring me down to Shelburne Road and have lunch and then come back. But I always had to get the Boston Post from my mother because she liked to do the crossword puzzles.
And that's when you lived on Mansfield Avenue.
When Mansfield Avenue was different. I used to live on Mansfield Avenue near Mount St. Mary. We would walk to school, and you're right. And then we had almost, what do you call it, solid session. We got about 1:30 or 2, and I'd be home about 3 and listen to Morton Downey's music on the radio. And someday I'd like to do a show on radio about here. Because,
Don McNeil and the Breakfast Club.
oh, man.
Do you remember that? Oh, see, you're so young. It was out of Chicago at 9 o'clock in the
No, I
morning.
don't remember that. But Dee Dee brought up a good question, because I don't remember the lanes, but I remember my uncles and his friends talking about it under the Flint Theater.
Oh my gosh.
They had a bowling alley there, and was it underneath or
And
on the
where's this?
side of the Flint Theater?
On Main Street.
On Main Street. And the
don't
kids,
remember that.
I remember
Oh, I know.
Bill Nana telling me that he would get paid a penny a string to reset way before they had automatic resets.
Bill used to do that at UVM in the Waterman building.
Oh.
Can I
Okay.
tell my story about bowling?
Please do.
I lived in Mansfield Avenue, and we'd set up pins in the Waterman building.
Okay.
And that was tough work. I mean, you had two
Yeah.
people bowling all the time. As soon as somebody bowled a string and they knocked down the pins, you had to set them up. And then by that time, the next time, so we were going all the time. And we found out that people who were good tippers, before they bowled, so if you were a good tipper, I put and this is before they had the spots,
Yep.
okay? I put the pins closer together so you get a strike a lot easier. However,
boy.
if you're a poor tipper, oh man.
They were spread out?
We spread it right out. So you had a tough time doing that.
Couldn't get them all down if you wanted to.
What floor of the Waterman was that?
What's that?
Where was the bowling alley in the Waterman?
In the basement there.
In the basement.
Yeah. And that's a good topic we talk about. Where are the bowling alleys in Burlington? The YMCA, the Waterman building.
There was one at Cathedral Grammar School. Did you know that?
no, I
Oh,
did not.
Not the grammar school. Well, it used to be the high school.
Oh, I remember going, and when I was in high school, going to St. Mark's to the
The center up there.
St. Mark's Center.
That's
We
still
did a lot.
going.
We
It is
did
still
bowling
going.
there.
Okay.
It's amazing.
So the bowling alley is upstairs up over in the back of the Flynn Theater. on Church Street. There's a bowling alley upstairs.
No kidding.
that.
Wow.
Alfred Parada used to bowl there quite a bit. Remember that name?
Alfred Parada and my grandfather were best of friends. And
The Paradas were related to the Mercaldos, right?
I think they were.
I think Mr. Parada was a grandfather, maybe, of the Mercaldo boys.
I just came across a picture of Alfred Parada and my grandfather coming back from Italy together. They went and made a trip over to see their families. And so all of that area around Dunkin' Donuts,
That was Parada Place. No.
Place and Alfred Street, that's,
Place.
he
They were
was, yeah.
at right angle, yeah.
Were they from the same town in Italy?
I think they were outside of Naples in Cervinara.
Oh, isn't that
As where I
wonderful?
believe the Verricchionis were as well. And yeah, it was a tight community of
amazing.
these immigrants.
It's funny that Burlington did have some sort of a, I won't say demarcation line, but immigrants seem to go in certain areas of the city, as they are to some degree now. And I don't know why that is now, but there seems to be, the Irish used to be in certain areas, and we have the French people at St. Joseph's Church,
Yes.
Irish went to Christ the King, and French went to St. Anthony, those
That's
kind of ethnic groups, I guess. I don't know how that ever worked, how they ever formed that way.
When
but-
going through some of my grandfather's papers and belongings, I came across a certificate from the city of Burlington. He had one of the first employment agencies, but he catered to Italians, and I think that was probably some of the reason that so many Italians settled there, because he came over early. And, he'd find that there was a job at the brush factory or, on the railroad.
But, interestingly enough, the Italians really didn't get into organized politics, though, much, did they?
Not so much here. They
The
certainly
the
didn't
Irish
vary.
seemed to, that's the way they were trying
Yeah.
to pull themselves up,
Yep.
was through the political scene. But the Italians, I think, were more hands-on. They were workers. They were
Yes.
culinary greats
Yep.
and had a lot to do with wonderful food and stuff.
And it was, that was very important to them.
Yeah.
A Christmas Eve at my grandfather's house, my grandfather's grandparents lived up over the store. So my father and his brothers, at this point, my grandfather was retired, would close the store around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then people would just start, all friends, and my grandparents' friends would come up, and they'd bring these bottles of wine that they had made over
Homemade.
the summer.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
making me thirsty.
Yeah.
So thirsty, it's time to wrap up.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Jane, for being here,
was so
Joey, for
interesting.
participating. And we'll see you next time on Stump the Chumps.
And
have a Merry Christmas,
Merry Christmas.
for all of you. See you guys.
Bye-bye. See, I told you to sell by